for being with us on this fine Tuesday, the 14th of June. Really grateful that one of the contributors of my new book, Inside Out Transformation, Annika Hurwitt, is here with me today. Remind me where you are, Annika. I forgot. Oh, Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah, back on Martha's Vineyard. I'm mostly from this island, and I returned here in the fall.
Nice. Yeah. Well, it's lovely to have. It's lovely to speak to you again, and have you here with us for this hour's Zoom gathering in honor of the launching of the book. And I just want to, for people who might not know you, and I'm really hoping that these recordings do get out to people that we don't know and have no understanding of the inside out. So just to set the scene a little bit. So Annika, you are an internationally recognized teacher, consultant and coach, and you have a background in journalism and psychology. And in 1993, your life was transformed when you were introduced to a new paradigm that provides, and this is the bit that I really want to look at today with you, the science behind how the mind works. I love that. You've got real clarity on that. And so since you've been using this new paradigm to bring out the best in hundreds of leaders and teams that you coach, as well as individuals and couples you work with. So you've recently returned to your beautiful island of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, which you just said. So warm welcome to you, Annika, and to everybody here. And so the sort of format of this is we'll have a little bit of a conversation, and I'm going to open it up for quite Q&A to people who are here who would like to ask you anything, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So my first question to you in your chapter in the book, let me just open the book, was, how do you describe the work that you do with clients? And I'm not expecting you to remember what you said to me in that chapter. But what I really loved about what you shared, again, for me, was you talk about it a little bit differently than other people, I feel. That's just my experience of it. So you said, I help people realize that just like everything else in nature, we're part of a pre-existing spiritual system. In nature, we find repeating patterns such as fractals and the Fibonacci series, I hope I said that right, which are found in the trees, the rocks, and the flowers. And these patterns are designed so that everything in nature thrives and functions at its best. And you go on, and I don't know if you want to continue from there, because that's just a little reminder, but I'd love for you to speak to it in the way that you speak. To me, that sounds like the science behind where you work.
I mean, and it's really the marriage of science and mysticism, you know, from where I sit. I think that, you know, as a child, I would go out into nature and I could feel something special, and it would always calm me down, you know. And now there's research that shows that when the mind lights on a fractal, which nature is full of this repeating pattern called a fractal, our minds calm themselves down. And so this discovery that of principles, that there's a repeating pattern that explains our psychological lives. I mean, just think about the implications of that, you know, that we have these repeating patterns in nature that have the capacity to create awe and wonder and mental calm. And then we have this discovery of a repeating pattern that explains our psychological, spiritual lives. And as you know, Sheila, because you've been on this path for a while, there's a magic and a power to these principles. And I love the marriage of the spiritual and the mystical, because I mean, the scientific and the mystical, because to me, that's our world. You know, we have logic, we have science, we have explanations of things. And then there is that component of life that is a mystery and that is bigger than we are. And when I trained as a psychotherapist for 10 years, I had a master's in transpersonal psychology, and I I got that master's because I was trying to find the link between psychology and spirituality. And I studied everything. You know, I did a year at the Jung Institute. I studied it all. And I was very disappointed because at the end of my studies, I was convinced that that link did not exist. You know, the spiritual psychologies, in my experience, they talk about your psychological life, then they give you a technique to visit, you know, like Jung's collective unconscious, come back with a symbol. But the impact was very limited. And the link for me wasn't actually there. And then when I was introduced to these principles, I saw the link that, you know, this discovery of these 3 psycho-spiritual principles create that link between these 2 worlds. And for some reason, when you introduce these principles to people who are ready, you know, it goes beyond a walk in nature where your eyes land on fractals and you feel better, but then you go home and all your unconscious thought patterns power back up. Now you have a conscious bridge between your psychological life and what creates it and what comes before it, so that you can metaphorically have a walk in the woods at any moment that you remember about these principles and how they work. So I've always been fascinated by what makes people tick. That's what I was doing as a journalist before I became a therapist. I was studying the creative process and interviewing artists and writers. And then in psychology, I was trying to find what made people tick. And I am 30 years into this, so grateful to have been introduced to this discovery, because it really does explain what makes people tick. And when you share that with people who are ready, their lives transform and they can actually have happy lives, which is what we were put on earth to experience, in my opinion. So how's that for a long answer to your question?
That's a beautiful answer. It's just perfect. Yeah, and I've learned some new stuff about you that I didn't know. Yeah. The journalism is, yeah, it's an interesting start. And then on to the psycho. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I interviewed writers and had those interviews published, you know, and basically was doing the same thing in a different form, you know, studying how human beings tick. But I've always been also fascinated by the creative process because I'm a writer myself. Yeah.
So when will you be writing your book?
Good question. I feel like coming back to Martha's Vineyard, it's time to do that now. Yeah. So that's a very pertinent question, and you can hold me to it. And
I will.
It's time. It's really time.
I know you've got lots to share, having heard some of your teachings, for sure.
Yes, I do. I have lots to share. And I think I've just been waiting for, you know, the right time. And because of course, like most people who share the principles, I don't just want to write a book. I want to write something that will really speak to people. And so I feel ready for that. And also I've been working with women leaders for quite a few years, and I have a passion for empowering more women to take leadership roles, just to create more balance in our world. I also work with male leaders, but I want to see our world come more into balance. So and being a woman who was raised in a period before women were given much leadership roles or treated, you know, as equal partners, I have a passion for empowering women. So I have a book about that as well that's been simmering for a while.
Oh, that sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Look forward to seeing how that unfolds.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up about working with women, female leaders, women leaders. What is it about the inside out understanding that we're referring to, the 3 principles, and also referred to as the inside out? What is it about that when they hear about it, understand how does that impact their leadership, or their wanting to go into leadership, be a leader?
Well, many of the women leaders I work with have landed in a leadership role because they listen to their gut to make decisions, but because they don't have the science behind how that works. Most of the ones, at least who come to me for help, are quite insecure about it because they feel like, well, I just had a gut feeling and I went with it and it worked out, but I don't know how long I'm going to be able to continue having this luck, you know. So I find that confident decision making is probably the biggest draw for women leaders. You know, women leaders often, as I said, have an instinctual ability to come from the gut, but because they don't understand about different levels of thinking and how it works, they don't have confidence in it. And I do feel that that's one of the biggest gifts that the principles give everyone, you know, is the ability to recognize healthy thinking versus what you might call illusory thinking, insecure thinking, thinking that it's going to create, you know, less mental clarity and lead to poorer decisions, and the ability to recognize that flow of healthy thinking that comes with a feeling, and usually means your mind is calm and open enough to receive insights, and that those decisions that come through insight play out well 99% of the time. So the women leaders I coach, they will often go through a training program with me, you know, that includes some coaching and an intensive, and they come out confident in their decisions, which, what a relief, right? For leaders and for all of us, because we're all making decisions all the time. You know, it's very relieving to know when you know. Very relieving. I use it from everything to the mundane to, you know, the very significant decisions in my life.
Would you say more about that? Because I think decision making is such an important topic for everybody.
Yeah.
Would you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you know, as I said I believe in the interview, and you quoted me, you know, we are designed perfectly like everything in nature. So like everything in nature, we're designed to be active mentally, and then to let our minds rest. But most of us don't let our minds rest unless we're meditating or maybe doing our favorite activity, you know, which could be a sport or a craft or an art. But in learning the principles, one of the things that happens is you become much more aware of the world of feeling and how it reflects your thinking states. And so you become more aware that, you know, my mind is tired now. It's time to let it rest. And our minds will rest whenever we allow them. People, you know, I meditated for decades before the principles. Nothing wrong with meditation, but people don't understand that our minds are designed to go into a state of mental rest or meditation whenever we allow them. So as you start to have more eyes for that, you realize when I can let my mind rest when I'm doing the dishes, when I'm driving, when I'm putting my clothes away. And the reason that's important is that the more our minds rest, the sharper our minds become when we use them. So that's very important for all of us, and of course, leaders. And the more our minds rest, the more space there is for that whole spectrum of common sense to wisdom and insight to come in. So, you know, when I first learned about this, actually, the reason I came to the principles was because I was struggling with a really big decision. And I knew that I didn't know how to make that decision. And I knew that the suggestions friends and therapists were giving me were not ones I would trust to make a really big decision. You know, like put a certain number of points next to these pluses and minuses. I thought, there's no way I'm going to make a life decision based on that. So, when I first learned about this, and I started having eyes for how, when my mind relaxes, insights will come in and answers to questions and decisions. I used to kind of work at it. Like I'd make sure I went for a half an hour walk and that my mind would just settle itself, and I'd see if I'd get any answers. And I often would. But, you know, over time, it just becomes the most natural thing in the world. Your mind, you'll think about something, or I'll forget about it. And sometimes 5 minutes later, it's like, okay, here's your answer. And it always comes with a different feeling than we have when we're pulling up data. It's like it's a thought sliding in. It's a receiving of thought. And it's just a different level of consciousness, and you learn to recognize it. It's not, you know, some big mystical thing, but I guess you could say it comes with a good feeling. I used to say it's sort of like a fish landing on the pier, you know, it's just there. And it's everything from the mundane to the big decisions. You know, recently it started happening to me with shopping, which seems kind of funny to me, but it saves me a lot of time. If I go into a store and I look at a dress, I hear no, I'm like, okay. It's a great gift. You know, I think that as we gain our mental clarity about decisions, our lives becomes much more efficient, and we can do so much more, because we're always going to make mistakes, and that's part of the creative process. But you make more good moves, you know, and you waste less time. Yeah. Maybe that should be my book.
Yeah, maybe that could be. That could be. No, I love that. I love what you've just shared, Annika. It's it sounds very simple on the one hand, like our minds, but I like the piece where you said our minds are designed for rest. I think that's the key, isn't it? It's like we haven't been taught that. We haven't been taught. We've been taught to think and work things out and grind and figure it out. And you'll find the answer if you work hard enough at it. You'll find the answer. So to hear that, no, actually, the answer will come to you if you rest. If you let your mind rest, that's pretty new news to a lot of people, I think.
It is. And I think when, you know, people, when you're new to the principles and you start hanging out with people who've been involved with it for a while, there's sometimes, you know, we let our minds rest when there's nothing to think about. Or if someone asks me a question, I might take a minute or two to just mull it over, you know. And sometimes people are very uncomfortable. They're like, are you okay? Or like, here's the answer. I'm like, no, it's all right. You know, because we're used to just filling the space, you know. But actually, when you're around people who've been with the principles for a while, that rhythm is completely natural. And it's so refreshing. It's so restful to start to live that way yourself. And then to spend time with people who live that way, because you don't have to be on all the time when you're around people. You know, and the present moment is always here. So why not visit it once in a while?
Yeah, as if you could ever get away from it, right?
Yes, yeah.
Just being present to presence. Yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is changing gears, but when I was reading through your chapter, because I always read through the chapter to remind me of, you know, what people shared with me. So one of the questions that I asked everybody was about their process. Do you have a process when you work with people? And I think that is interesting for people to hear about. So would you like to share your process?
Sure. You know, I read Sandy's chapter. Sandy's a dear friend of mine, Sandy Crott, and you know, she talks so beautifully in there about listening and not necessarily teaching. And then I go to my chapter and I'm like, yeah, I just talk about the principles, you know. And I thought, yeah, maybe I should sit back and listen more. And then I had a new client just before this talk, and you know what I find, Sheila, is people come to the principles, at least to me, when they're ready to grow. So I will listen for a while. I will always ask people, you know, what their concerns are, what they'd like help with. And then I tend to ask people when they're the happiest, which often throws people off because they've never been asked that by a therapist or a coach before. And that helps people identify moments when they allow their minds to rest, you know. And it also completely kind of reverses the paradigm that most people come into therapy about, like, let's talk about our problems. Let's talk about when we're happy, when we experience joy, when we experience well-being. And then I start to teach people about what that is. Just what I was talking about here, you know, that our minds are designed to rest when we allow them to, and when they do, we are in our mental health and well-being. So all of that work that the client has been doing previous to meeting with me on their thinking, trying to change their thinking, trying to make their thinking positive, none of that, it's all out the window when you're in the present. Your well-being and your mental health are as intact as the day you were born. That is a very big change in perception and perspective for many people. For many people, it gives them hope. For many people, it's a relief and disorienting because they've been trying so hard to run their mental health system. And I explained that, first of all, we are not capable of it. We have 1 to 200,000 thoughts a day. Most of them are unconscious. There's no way any human being could make them all the right thoughts, you know. And then, you know, I was thinking about this with this client today because I thought, yeah, I'm going to hold back, you know, I'm just going to listen. And she was so ready to learn about the principles. So, you know, what I do is I put a toe in the water and I'll say, you know, I do have a 30-minute video on my AnnikaHurwitt.com website. I have several websites, but it's on that website. And I do ask all my new clients to watch it before they work with me, because it does give the explanation of this single paradigm versus thinking that the world, that our feelings come from both circumstances and our thinking. So part of my process is I insist that people watch that before we work together. It saves us a half an hour. And having done this as long as I have, I would prefer not to repeat myself. Oh, you know, as I'd like to repeat myself. Yeah, I'd like to save myself that when I can. And then, you know, it's really a question of throwing a little bit out there about how the mind works and seeing how interested the client is. So I'll talk a little bit about why it is that when we're in the illusion that the world can make us feel something that we do or do not want to feel, why that creates mental stress and distress, how that misperception throws us off, and how it leads to a mental scrambling. Because if one thing on the outside can make you feel something, then to the brain, which functions on the level of logic, then everything can. So while it looks like you're upset because you had a fight with a friend, when it looks like the fight can make you feel things, you are going to be insecure no matter what. But as soon as you realize that you're feeling thought in the moment about any event, when you realize that in the larger sense of the word, your mind will calm itself no matter what the event is. So I'm feeling in with the client, you know, does this make sense? Do you want to hear more? Not everybody is ready to learn this. Do you want to learn this? And this particular client was, you know, I've been waiting to learn this for decades, you know. So to me, it was just, you know, we all work in our individual ways. And if I can, and, you know, when I say I'm checking in, I'm listening all the time for the feeling in the session. You know, are they engaged? Is this making them hopeful? Are they interested? And are they ready? So, you know, over time as a 3P coach, I've learned there are so many people who are ready for this and so eager for it. And it's such a joy and a privilege to be working with those people. And then there's many people who aren't, and that's not a problem at all. It's just good to find that out right away. I actually had a client once, this was about a decade ago, but I'll never forget it. She was on medication for depression. And at that point, I had got just a lot of people had gotten off medication working with me on their own. It's not a goal that I set. And so I very enthusiastically mentioned this to this young woman, and she came back the next session and said, no, I don't want to get off medication. I just want to talk. I just want someone to listen to my problems. And I realized, oh yeah, so there are people who are not ready. Not everybody is ready. And that's not a problem. It's just good to know, like I do find sometimes people who are newer or having trouble finding clients will sometimes come to me for advice, and they'll talk about, well, gosh, I approached this doctor or this person who seemed to need this so much, and I told them all about it, and I just can't believe that they don't want to work with me. And then I had this other experience, with this other person, and I remember saying to this particular person, stop knocking on the closed doors. There's so many open ones, but you just have to be available. And I do feel like the universe sends me so many people who are ready, and that there's an intelligence behind life. And I'm so grateful for that, because it is very joyful to share these principles with people who need help and who start healing and evolving because of them. It's a constant source of, joy and celebration. Yeah.
Beautiful. Oh, there's so much in what you shared, Annika. Thank you.
You're welcome. I always record my sessions because they're almost all on Zoom, and I always send my clients the recordings, and I ask them to watch them or listen to them. Because again, the more you hear this, the faster you progress. And there's going to be sessions where more significant things are taught or learned. And I feel that that's a very important resource for people.
Yeah, me too. I record mine too.
Yeah.
I think if people take the time to listen to them and watch back, there is so much, because we're a work, not a work, but we're in process, aren't we? We're in process. Nothing stays the same. And so what seemed true yesterday or might be true next week, when we listen to them, for me, definitely, when I listen to myself or hear myself say something, it's like, wow, I used to believe that, or I thought that. Really?
Last week, yeah. I believed that.
yeah, and that's just it's a great example, isn't it, of how thought is forever changing, and why we don't have to believe everything we think. Doesn't make sense anymore. It's like, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, looking at the time, is there anybody who has a question for Annika? Reactions button, you can raise your digital hand if you'd like to ask a question or speak to Annika. Please feel free. I can continue conversing if nobody has a question for now, but please feel free to. Marie, would you like to ask something?
Yes, I just would like to ask, what was that video you're referring your clients to? Is that something you have pre-recorded, or is it something with Keith Blevins or?
Yes, no, it's actually a talk that I gave at a women's network.
Okay, yeah.
And it's a 30-minute talk that is a very concise explanation of the single paradigm.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And anyone can access it on my website.
I can link, it's annikahurwitt.com, right? I can share that link underneath the video.
Yes. Yeah. And I should say, it's people sometimes have trouble finding the video if they're looking at my website on their phones, because it's at the top of my homepage. So better to look at it from a computer.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Take advantage of speaking to someone who works with a lot of people, leaders and couples and organizations. Go, Fatima, feel free.
Hi, Annika.
Hi. Who is that?
This is the first time. My name is Fatima.
Hi, Fatima.
Hi. This is the first time I hear that we have to give our brain a break. This is the first time.
Wow. Wow.
So it's really powerful to hear that.
Yes.
What I wanted to ask, you seem to be very advanced in the three principle. How do you know that you are in your head versus in your wisdom?
Great question. It's by the feeling. And that's going to be a process of discovery for you. So, you know, when you get a break, notice the feelings. It's that whole world of presence, calm, well-being, sort of an absence of ego. And when you're in your head, it's ego feelings, which can be urgency. It's almost like a data feeling without that deeper feeling of the present moment. A little bit of self-importance, or any reactive feeling is an ego feeling. And so this is something that my clients build awareness of, because the world of the ego and its functioning, it's a very powerful database. But as I have often said, it's like a vast library, like the Bodleian Library in Oxford, England. But there's no librarian in the library. There's no wisdom or even common sense. Those functions of the mind exist in our universal mind, and the two are meant to work in tandem. So it's important that that you start to recognize the feeling of the use of the ego mind and the limits of it. And to begin to open up that space for them to work together. Does that make sense?
Intellectually, yes, but experientially,
yeah,
it's difficult to. Intellectually, it's very clear.
Yeah.
But experience,
Yes.
how do you catch yourself? Because of one paradigm that is very strong in me, and that paradigm is that there is one universal mind. So the one universal mind powers the space that we like to call wisdom, but it also powers the space of thought. It's we are being lived by that energy, and that energy is one.
Yes.
So even though I understand that it's different feelings, I'm still not clear on how to catch myself experiencing that feeling when I am in my thought, and experiencing the other feeling when I am in my mind.
It's a journey. It's an experiential journey. And I can point you towards the beginning of it. And that is, as I said, noticing the feelings you experience when your mind does rest. Do you ever have mental rest? That's a question. Yes?
Yes, of course. When you go for a walk, when you are relaxed, when you go for the spa,
yes,
when you are in nature, when you are with. Yes, of course.
So if you build awareness of all that whole feeling spectrum there, the thoughts that you have when you're in that place are most likely of a more universal nature. Your feelings are always showing you where you are in thought. And then, and if you start to build awareness of those beautiful feelings, then when you're in the ego, the contrast becomes more obvious. Sometimes, you know, this is one of the benefits that people get from doing 4-day intensives, is that they get a long enough break from the ego mind that when they're in it, they recognize it. But, you know, every person is individual. You may be able to build that awareness through your determination, let's say, to really notice and kind of bathe in the beautiful feelings that you experience when you are getting a break. Then you're more likely to notice when you're in your ego mind. It doesn't mean, it's true, it's all powered up by mind or God, or, you know, however you think of it, however, you know, your frame of reference is for that. It is all powered up by this one universal energy. But it's important to know when we're connecting with our universal mind and when we are in our personal minds, because they have different uses.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was a very good question. And
Yeah.
a very good answer, of course. Yeah. Does anybody else have a question for Annika? See who's here. And if not, we can keep talking, can't we, Annika?
Did this gentleman have a question?
I don't know who you're looking at.
Oh, in the upper right.
I'd have different screen to you.
Oh, yeah. I don't know his name, isn't there?
Unmute yourself, please, if anybody has
have
a question.
Yeah, no question too small.
No. That's okay. Well, I was going to, you've actually mentioned something that I was going to bring up, and that was the story that you shared in the book. When, you know, I asked everybody as well if they would like to could share a story about a successful outcome and a not so successful outcome. And the story that you shared with me, I thought was really impactful, was about somebody who was depressed. She was laying on the sofa, unable to get up and do much of anything. And I think it was within 3 sessions, everything had completely changed and she was out living life to the full. That to me is a testament to somebody, I guess, or something that was ready, something was ready to hear something very profound and insightful. And you touched on that you work with people who have had depression and they come off the medication. So I just wondered if that's common for you in your practice, that we could say, yeah, it's a pretty common outcome, that people can come out of depression pretty quickly and easily without too much, people that can spend years in therapy and still feel depressed. So I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Absolutely. I told that story because it was unusual. I so far, knock on wood, anybody who's come to me with depression has gotten out of the depression. However, the reason I shared that story was it was unusual because most people who come to me with depression have had it for much longer. And the problem isn't so much the depression, it's all the thinking they have about the depression. So they've been to doctors, they've been told it's not curable, it's genetic. All we can do is try to get you the right medication. So you have depression, in my experience, is always a result of anxiety gone on too long. So people are anxious and anxious and anxious, and eventually their minds collapse under the weight of it. It's depressing to be anxious all the time. Then they start getting all of the belief systems thrown at them about depression. It's a disease, all this stuff. In my opinion, none of that is true. It's thought. So that woman was unusual. because she actually had not been depressed for very long. She had maybe been depressed for 6 months or so when she came to me, but she didn't have a history of depression and she hadn't seen other doctors. So no one had told her it was incurable. And no one had told her it was a disease, you know. So she heard what I taught her and she was done. Most people with depression, much of the work is getting through the belief systems that have been created around the depression, and then they'll come out of it with working with the 3 principles. So it will take longer. Now, I never want to say it will always take longer, because again, that's the beauty of this work. Every person responds uniquely and individually. But that's just been my experience. I'll always do intensives with people with depression. And whereas with anxiety, people need 1 intensive, with depression, they often need 2, you know, just because of the belief systems that have formed often for decades before they see me. But
Yeah.
if you can get off medication and have a happy life, it's worth it.
Gosh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. You know what struck me just then when you said, well, you know, she hadn't been depressed for very long, only 6 months. To me, it's like, only 6 months? That sounds like a long time, right?
Yeah, but most people who come to me with depression, it's decades.
Wow.
Now, sometimes I'll get a teenager. I won't work with teenagers unless I work with their parents as well. But a depressed teenager, and they'll come out in like usually by the 2nd day of the 4-day intensive, because they haven't been in it nearly as long, and they, you know, their mind is much less programmed, you know. And that's one of the beauties again of these principles, is in some ways the less training we have, the less education, many times people will respond more immediately, because they are so much our nature, you know. So when the layers of thought are removed, people see this quickly, because it's us, it's real, it's how we work.
Yeah, I agree. I think people who come to this, including myself, who've been through other types of personal development, or have been through different types of personal development work, like NLP and hypnotherapy, and you know, I did a Louise Hay training, and there's all, you know, this whole array of things that we can train in. But if we've already trained in something that talks about how thinking works, how thought works, how beliefs work, we've got limiting beliefs, this is how you get rid of them, that can really get in the way of somebody hearing the simplicity of the principles. That was my experience, and that's been my experience working with other people as well, and talking with colleagues and friends. It can be a stumbling block, because we think we already know what thinking is, we know what thought is, we know how limited beliefs work, and so we have an idea of what we know, and what we know gets in the way of actually what's true.
Yes, and then, you know, you asked about if I have a process. I will often, with a new client, teach them a little bit about listening, about, you know, there's a chart that I use that helps people see that they're either listening through distracted thinking or through comparing and contrasting. And when I make that visual for people, it puts us way ahead as far as the learning curve, because it's an invitation for them to just hear what I'm saying rather than filter it through what they already know. And that does speed up the learning a lot, because otherwise you end up in some very useless conversations. You know, you'll have taught a whole bunch of what you thought were valuable things, and what comes back at you is a little bit of what you said and a whole lot of things you didn't say, you know. So I do find that you know, helping people with their listening right in the beginning is very useful. Is that a hand?
I agree. Yes, Fatima, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, Annika, in the beginning of your presentation, you said something that really resonated with me. You spoke about the the reason why you were so attracted to the three principles is that it allowed you to see the spiritual connection and the psychological connection.
Yes.
And that's one of the only reason also why I was attracted to the three principles.
Yes.
And I just wanted to ask if you could speak more about this connection between the spiritual paradigm and the psychological paradigm.
Yeah. I'm just thinking for a minute. I guess to my common sense, they had to be connected. It's Fatima, right?
Yes.
Because people, myself included, went to meditation both to calm down and to become happy and free. And then it wasn't really clear to me what they were going to psychology for. You know, you're supposed to figure out your problems, but half the time that wasn't all that helpful. So, you know, while there's aspects of therapy that are useful, like a therapist who listens well and bringing awareness to the issues you want help with, ultimately the goal from where I was sitting was happiness, and people experience that naturally from mental calm. And I knew both from my being in psychotherapy, becoming a psychotherapist and being a meditator, that with all of that work I had done, I was not living a happy life. I wasn't unhappy. I was just very happy when I meditated, and the rest of the time working on my problems like everybody else. So it always looked to me like if the two could be linked, then the psychological field could actually bring people happiness. And they weren't linked in the spiritual psychologies that I studied. Like I said, it was more like living in a psychological world and visiting a spiritual. So you got these little glimpses, but it wasn't really that much different than what my life was like pre-principles. You know, I got these glimpses, but it wasn't where I lived. So there is something so beneficial about seeing, you know, some of the many things that these principles make evident, not the least of which is that we are able to live in the here and now much of the time, that when we develop eyes for it, we allow our minds to land there more and more often, and that we will experience our God-given right to a happy and fulfilling life much of the time and in a very natural way. And then that becomes the foundation for healing trauma and other anxiety or depression if you have those issues. But the mind needs to be resilient and strong to be able to get over things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? The last few minutes together. Well, I'm going to go for another question. Sorry about the background noise. I'm going to go for another question out of the book out of my book. If there's one thing that you could tell your younger self, what would that be, Annika?
Now, is that in any regard, or is that regarding something?
Well, you for now, any regard. Any regard.
Well, I don't know. There isn't this strong a message there, but I'll tell a little story. The very first time I was asked to speak at a Three Principles conference, which was probably 27 years ago, I was asked to talk about the role of faith in teaching the Three Principles. And it was a very challenging topic for me because I was not raised with religion. And I didn't know what faith was, or I thought I didn't know. So I was reflecting and reflecting, and I imagine we've all had this experience where you have a deadline and it's looming. And this was a very big one because it meant speaking in public to a large community about something that had become the most important thing in my life. And shortly, maybe a night or two before I was to give this talk, I was brought a question out of nowhere. And we all learn with the principles that that larger mind will bring us questions from time to time to jog insights. And the question was, what was your life like before the principles? Now, I'd only been involved for about 3 years, but you start to live in the present, and I hadn't thought about my life much. And I started to think about it, and I realized, wow, I have changed so much. I had a hard life in many ways. I ended up raising myself for the most part. I mean, and there were stressful events that I experienced. I also had a lot of privileges, great education and all of that. But, and I thought, wow, you really like toughed it out. And then I thought, well, what kept you going? This is all coming from mind. And I thought about it and I realized, well, I always knew that life was supposed to be better than that. And then the question came, well, how did you know that? And then I realized it was faith. So the answer to, and again, this is good learning for all of us. When we put a question out to the unknown, when there's space, that larger mind will bring you insights. That was a very big insight for me. Somehow I realized something that had been inside me all along, but I didn't know it, which was this faith about how life was supposed to be. And where I got it from, I don't know. But what I would tell my younger self is, you were right. Good for you for hanging in there. And that you will find it. And it will all work out fine in the end, as it has. So, we're all gifted that way, no matter what challenges we face. We all have access to wisdom. We all have access to insight. We all have access to this larger mind. And I do feel that it's taking care of us. And since being involved with the principles, it's much more obvious how that's at work all the time. So you learn to kind of relax even when life is not going the way you think it should, because you see more and more and more and more how life is taking care of you, and that it's often pointing you in a direction you wouldn't expect.
I love that. That you noticed that you had faith, that you realized that you had faith without. It's funny, isn't it? Because for me, it sounds like there's a label of somebody was asking you to speak about something called faith.
Yeah. And
then when you looked, it's like, oh, that label can go on this. That's how it sounded to me.
Oh, well, yeah. It's I guess faith is like love. It's somehow a quality built into life.
Yeah.
But I had no conscious awareness of it until that moment. And it is powerful when you have conscious awareness of it.
Do you think there's a difference between faith and knowing?
Yes, I do. Faith is like, I don't know, it's hard to put into words, but it's like an invisible consciousness bridge between what the spiritual, which is what will unfold, and our lives as they are now. Whereas knowing is when you know something, when you have common sense or wisdom coming into you and you know something. That's how I think about it. I don't know how other people would talk about faith. I'll find out.
Or maybe faith, I was just thinking, for me, faith is trusting in something you don't know yet. Maybe.
Yes.
Perhaps it's the opposite. I was just trying to.
Yeah. Yeah,
in a
that
way.
is, you know, what is the quote from? I think it's Goethe. Faith. Faith is something about trusting in the unseen world, which has not yet become evident. It's a beautiful quote. I wish I could remember it, but
I've not heard that one.
yeah, trusting in things unseen.
Well, listen, Annika, it's been lovely to hang out with you for this time, and everybody else, of course. And thank you for your questions and your presence, for being with Annika and I. Annika, is there, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Well, my email is my name, Annika Hurwitt @gmail.com, or Annika @annikahurwitt.com. That's one of my websites. And there's also courses.annikahurwitt.com, which will take you to a membership program that I started up a few months ago, that people can join every few months. A new semester begins. So the program is Spiritual Nourishment for the Soul, and we're in the Coming Home semester right now. In the fall, it will be Our True Identity. So those are places. And if you're interested in women's leadership, just email me. I have a website about that too, but I don't want to overwhelm you.
Beautiful. I'll share those links in the email that goes out with the recording tomorrow. Okay, thank you once again, everybody, for being here. And yeah, we'll see you next week. We have Joe Bailey. So
you're in for a treat.
Yeah, we had Sandy Crott last week, didn't she?
Yeah. I know. Thank you all so much for coming. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.